The broadcast is live.
We're alive. It is happening. It is happening. Okay, I'm going to add husband to the stream. Okay, so now I'm going to share it. Can I share? I don't know.
I feel like we have all learned these amazing technological skills over the past year. And I feel like for me, it was the 2 weeks, exactly this time last year when I was trying to cram all of my classes to go remote. There was about a 48-hour period where I was just learning all
everything.
Yeah. It felt like I was back in school in a way that I hadn't been in a really long time.
Yeah.
Going to bed tired, waking up tired, and just kind of doing. But
well, it's something because we had a meeting and I was looking through my emails and I was like, oh, it'd be interesting to see where we were a year from now or a year ago. And it was like, everyone get out the building, only essential stuff. It was amazing. I mean, yeah, stuff you just wouldn't even imagine, like having social workers to wear PPE gear as they go out and are working with families, masks, gloves, shoes. I mean, it was just surreal to think about that. So,
and everybody looks so inviting and friendly when they're dressed in their hazmat suits.
Right. Seriously. Seriously.
Yeah. We were allowed to go into our building, but we had to get permission from the dean. And so my old computer was 9 years old. So I had a cord that was starting to spark at the connection. And I was like, can I go in and get my extra cord? I don't want to burn my house down. And he was like, yeah, you can. You can
do that. That's a
pandemic acceptable.
That's a valid request.
Yeah.
It looks like it is 6 o'clock and I believe we are streaming. Okay. First time doing all this. So we're doing it. So we're excited and want to definitely welcome everyone who is watching via live. So I am Shanelle Dupree and I would describe myself as an author. I'm a lawyer. I am a Bible study teacher. I am an administrator for a social service agency here in Kansas. I'm a wife and I am a mama of 4. And something that I believe I'm really skilled at doing is being a strategic connector. And so on the live with us, we have someone who I was able to connect with, and that is Judge Renee Henry, who I'm going to ask to speak and introduce our guest in a moment. And Judge Henry, it was over a year ago, and we were at the Sunflower House Gala, and we were talking and discovered that we actually had a love, I'm going to add some folks to the stream, actually had a love for reading, and found out that we both enjoyed reading and things of that sort. And so we struck up a conversation and said, we should have and we also live in the same neighborhood, right? So I said, we were talking and we said, we should have some type of book club or something like that. And then, the pandemic hit. And so everything changed. And Judge Henry actually sent me a podcast, an excellently done podcast done by her cousin. And so I listened to that. And so then we connected again. And, sometimes I think we have a tendency of saying, hey, someone else should do this, right? I'm going to add folks after we do the introductions. Someone else should do this. Someone else should make this thing happen. But at some point, we have to decide that maybe that someone else is us. And so Renee and I got together and decided that we wanted to celebrate Women's History Month and thought that a cool way to do it would be by hearing from Dr. Robin. So I'm going to kick it to you, Judge Henry, so that you can introduce yourself and introduce your cousin.
All right. Well, welcome, everyone. We're so excited. Most of you probably know me. I'm Judge Renee Henry. I'm a district court judge here in Wyandotte County. I was elected in 2016 and currently serving my second term, and I also live in the same neighborhood as Shanelle Dupree, and we have had some very good conversations about some books we were interested in, and my cousin, Dr. Henry, put out an amazing podcast, and I immediately thought of Shanelle that she would enjoy it, and sent it to her, and came up with the idea of, instead of trying to get together a book club, maybe we could do kind of a podcast club. And so I did reach out to my cousin, Dr. Henry, and she very graciously agreed to have this conversation with us. So we're very excited to have her, excited for this discussion today. I'm just going to read you a really brief introduction to Dr. Henry and a very condensed list of all of her accomplishments. But Robin Henry is a scholar of gender and sexuality and legal and constitutional rights, including the late 20th and 21st century civil rights movement. She earned her PhD in U.S. history from Indiana University in Bloomington in 2006. She's an associate professor in the Department of History at Wichita State University, serves as the graduate coordinator of the MA program, and is a faculty fellow in the Dorothy and Bill Cohen Honors College. She's the author of numerous articles and chapters dealing with the construction of masculinity in the American West, sexual education in the early 20th century, the effects of legal dormancy on public policy and civil rights, and the memory of the Ludlow Massacre. She's a contributor to the KMUW commentary series, Past and Present, as well as the author and creator of the 6-part podcast, Hindsight, looking back at 100 years of women's suffrage. Her book, Criminalizing Sex, Defining Sexuality, Sexual Regulation and Masculinity in the American West, 1850 to 1927, is forthcoming from New York University Press. Currently, she's working on a book on the Colorado jurist and juvenile legal advocate, Benjamin Barr Lindsay, and she is also my cousin. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Robin.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you all very much, first of all, for that nice introduction, and also for the opportunity to come and participate in this event. It's been kind of amazing to figure out how many people have been listening or kind of circulating the podcast. One of the really terrible things, of course, that happened is that outside of the first episode, every single other episode was created during the pandemic. And so all of the public events that we had planned, all of the kind of listening parties, like what we're doing tonight, didn't happen. And so I don't have a sense as to who was listening or how far this has traveled. So it's really fun to talk about this. This was a wonderful project. It was a great opportunity for me to kind of use my historical skills and to put them in a different place. Most of the time I'm publishing in academic journals that I think my highest read article has been read by 30 people. So, this is a little bit different forum, but I think it's a fun forum because it can take what I do professionally and bring it into a wider audience and get people excited about history, and maybe getting them asking them questions about what type of history they're interested in, what they've learned, what they know, what they think they know. And in this case, it was really perfect because the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920, had its 100th anniversary in 2020. And that was the impetus of the podcast, KMUW. I've been a commentator for their series, as Judge Henry mentioned, I think since 2011, 2012, in the series Past and Present. It's myself, Dr. Robert Weems, and Dr. Jay Price, and we do a number of different fields. And that's been fun and is ongoing. But they contacted me because we had grant money from the National Endowment for the Humanities and Kansas Humanities Project. And they wanted to do a big project that looked at the 19th Amendment and looked at women's rights. And so I fit the bill as closely as they possibly could find. And it was a really nice opportunity for me to talk with historians that I've read, that I've never met, but was excited to read their work, and to expose people to a lot of different voices on history. And one of the themes that came out in all of the various celebrations and commemorations and conversations was really about the differences in what we think we know and what we really should know about the 19th Amendment. And the conversations that focused on racial exclusion or kind of the numbers and different types of non-white women or non-middle class women who participated in the movement was just really exciting. There's just a flood of books. My bookshelf there's a huge stack of books that I've read or yet to read that came from this year, from these projects. And what was really nice to learn were all of the stories and the histories of things that kind of fill in what we generally know about women's history, which
well, Robin, Dr. Henry, sorry. What I would say is that's the part that I think is so interesting regarding the perspective that you're bringing, because you are not just talking about the movement that most people saw, but you're talking about the undercurrent, so the other aspects and the other people that sometimes are overlooked, that were very much a part of this movement and had different needs within it. So women of color, people who were had different economic statuses, so not the middle class, not the wealthy. So I can't wait to get into it. What I want to do, we have folks who are joining. I would say I would hate to add you with a blank screen. So if you want to be on, if you want to turn on your camera so that I know that you want to be added, that would be amazing. And hello to everyone who's watching us live. Please finish your thought.
All right. Well, yeah, it was really my intention to highlight a lot of the different people. And one of the things that I think we often don't remember is that this is a 72-year plus movement just to get to the 19th Amendment. And then, as probably additional people know, not every woman gets the right to vote in 1920. And so it's a continued event deeper into the 20th century. And so that's going to encompass a number of generations. The people who started the movement don't live long enough to actually see even the fruition of the 19th Amendment. So there's just a lot of different people that are involved and get involved for, very personal reasons, very general reasons, and then reasons that we don't normally kind of think about in terms of activism. And in many ways, it's very similar to what we're doing tonight. Just sometimes it's a group of women from the same community getting together to kind of take the temperature of what their lives are like and to learn about kind of what they've been doing, listen to somebody talk, and then have a conversation afterward and kind of ask the question, well, what do we do now? And in many cases, it starts that simple. I mean, I think a lot of times when we think about people who are activists, they're people who are really famous. They're people who have, statues or have made really, really big, significant changes in terms of, becoming an important public figure or creating, a piece of legislation. But a lot of the people that are involved don't ever get to that status. And that's okay. But you need that groundswell of support in order to get any of that accomplished. And I think what was really nice is kind of highlighting those people. Tonight, we're going to be listening to part of an episode that highlights what I think of, and in particular for a group where we are in Kansas, is that Midwestern women and women in the West had a pretty significant role to play in passing suffrage, maybe not always the way that we think they get it passed. They get it passed in some really kind of not so nice ways sometimes. I think I make a statement in the podcast that not everybody's civil rights are on the table equally, that this is not a universalist movement. And so it's kind of interesting to see where people step up, where they fall short, and who actually is engaged in the movement.
Okay, so while that is happening, I'm going to mute and go ahead and share the screen and start the podcast. Robin, I think it's, so how did you start with this body of research?
Well, I was asked to do it, which was a really good thing. It was just kind of a given project, but I teach women's history classes at Wichita State. And so it was not outside of my general realm. I don't usually teach a whole year on the 19th Amendment or on women's suffrage. But so there was a lot of fun learning to go along with it. But it was nice to be able to share some of the things that I do in class with a broader audience as well. And I am joined by our dog, Sophie, who is also a big fan of the podcast. Yeah. You should maybe sit down. In 1876, Philadelphia hosted the first World's Fair to celebrate the centennial of the United States' Declaration of Independence. On July 4th, a formal celebration took place in the city's famous Independence Square, featuring distinguished politicians, thinkers, and leaders of the nation, and suffragists. The movement had suffered during the Civil War and debate on suffrage, but Susan B. Anthony was determined to remind her fellow Americans that the promises of the Declaration of Independence, while extended to African American men, had yet to make women full citizens. The day before, organizers had told the suffragists that they would be welcome on the condition that their tone remained celebratory and not critical. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was too offended to attend, but Anthony chose to participate. After listening to hours of exultant words, Anthony finally got her turn. Upon ascending to the podium, she declared, quote, "I present to you a Declaration of Rights from the women citizens of the United States." As Anthony continued to speak, copies of the 1876 Declaration of the Rights of the Women of the United States circulated. Based on the 1848 Declaration of Sentiments, this updated version was more strident, recognizing rights instead of sentiments, speaking of individual instead of collective rights, and instead of resolutions, it included articles of impeachment. After her speech, Anthony led a group of women 2 blocks to the United Unitarian Church to listen to women's rights activists speak. For weeks afterward, the energy of that day, both in the square and in the church, empowered women across the country to write to Anthony to have their names added to the new declaration. From this story, you would not imagine that the next few decades would be considered the low point of women's rights and suffrage activism. But activists saw this period as less promising, marked more by division and rejection than by triumphs. In their history of women's suffrage, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony referred to this time as the doldrums. African American suffragists called it the nadir. However, historians have begun to reconsider this categorization, seeing that the suffrage movement's promises, while not entirely fulfilled, did see some movement. Increasingly, women could vote in school and local elections. After the failed attempt at full suffrage in 1867, Kansas women won municipal suffrage in 1887. They had been voting in school board elections since 1861. Other state legislatures, in order to silence the chance of, quote, no taxation without representation, extended suffrage to tax-paying women. Granted, this was a small number of women simply because most women could not own property outright and thereby were not taxpayers. But this and other small overtures allowed suffragists to claim victories. Still, full national suffrage was always the goal. Some of the earliest change on this front came from a remote part of the American West, Wyoming Territory. In 1869, while the rest of the nation focused on Reconstruction efforts in the South and the tension between Congress and President Andrew Johnson, the legislature of this recently organized territory voted to enfranchise its non-Native American women. After waiting for a few days, the federally appointed territorial governor approved. This population of newly enfranchised Americans, around 1,500 women, were the first women since 1807 to have the franchise. This pivotal movement became part of Wyoming's identity, one that it carried through to statehood in 1890. Suffragists hoped that this small victory in a far-flung part of the nation would inspire activists and legislatures throughout the country to extend the franchise elsewhere. With this victory in Wyoming, the question of what would women do with their vote suddenly moved beyond theory and into practice, and supporters, skeptics, and detractors watched with curiosity. What women would do with their vote also spoke to the heart of what women's roles were and how women were valued in society, a question that continues today. Some women saw their access to the vote as a way to sweep out corruption that had long plagued politics. Others saw it as a way to reform communities, in particular to address the presence of alcohol by voting in temperance candidates and supporting temperance reforms. Still others saw the vote as a way to offset the political voices of people they did not consider to be, quote, real Americans, namely African American men and immigrants.
A very small number of women argued for suffrage rights based on autonomous citizenship rights. Opponents insisted that women's suffrage would upend the social order. While Wyoming's suffrage measure seemed to sail through without too much issue, Utah Territory and Colorado state suffrage provided a more realistic picture of the contentious and localized suffrage fights to come. In Utah, suffrage passed in 1870 because of three separate factions' views on how female voters would address the controversial issue of polygamy. While polygamy was eventually rejected by the Church of Latter-day Saints and specifically outlawed in Utah's state constitution, some LDS elders who supported the practice thought enfranchising women would increase the territory's electorate. Others hoped enfranchisement would help outsiders, who often held extreme prejudices against the LDS, to stop believing that they mistreated women. Non-LDS residents supported enfranchising women so that they would eventually vote to outlaw polygamy. For national suffragists who focused little on the issue of polygamy, they saw that they had secured the franchise in another territory. 2 territories in 2 years. Things were beginning to roll. Really, it's not hard to blame women suffragists for thinking this. After decades of not achieving very little movement forward, this new momentum seemed to signal a new day. In fact, 5 territories, Wyoming, Utah, Washington, Montana, and Alaska, all extended suffrage to women before statehood. For some, the fact that it came in a new region, the American West, seemed logical. While Native Americans and Latinx communities had called the region west of the Mississippi River home for centuries, Anglo-American settlement increased with great earnest after the Civil War. The federal government passed legislation such as the Homestead Act, the Pacific Railway Act, and the Morrill Land Grant Act in 1862 to encourage community settlement, development, and growth. It wanted to transform unorganized areas into territories that would eventually become states. And between 1876 and 1912, the final 11 states of the lower 48 joined the nation. Suffragists eyed this region for a number of reasons. First, a really commonly held narrative is that they believed that the resourcefulness of women settlers made it more difficult for men to deny them full citizenship rights. If women were building the infrastructure of their territories, it was hard to restrict their voting rights. While this version of the story isn't exactly wrong, it simplifies the regional, ethnic, religious, and class-based reasons that many held. Most women, regardless of background, viewed the vote as a tool to accomplish something else, and often that reason was not all that nice. However, the relative ease with which women won the vote in Wyoming and Utah does not reflect the difficulty of the territorial and state campaigns in the West or any region. These were long, hard-fought, and often unsuccessful movements that dragged on for years, sometimes decades. New Mexico women only achieved the franchise with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Colorado suffragists wanted to capitalize on their neighboring territories' successes, and in 1876, they saw their opportunity to make history. In the same year that Anthony declared the list of women's rights and the nation celebrated its centennial, Colorado Territory prepared to become a state. Suffragists wanted it to enter into the Union as the first state to secure women's suffrage. But to support women's suffrage in a territory was one thing. To support it in a state was a more difficult decision. Colorado suffragists petitioned the Constitutional Convention, but politicians balked. In tones reminiscent of the 15th Amendment debates, they told women to wait. They didn't want to risk Congress rejecting their Constitution and thus their petition for statehood because they had included this radical point. Instead, they promised that 1 year after statehood, Colorado politicians would offer a voter referendum on the question of women's suffrage. Suffragists accepted this deal. The referendum would not require congressional approval and would only need a simple majority. But the fight for suffrage was not simple. Promptly after statehood, the Colorado Women's Suffrage Association formed. The CWSA sent representatives to mining towns, to the Spanish-speaking areas of the state, and into the immigrant neighborhoods of Denver. The vote was set for October 1877. Early on, it became clear that one of the suffrage movement's largest bases of support, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was going to face problems. Suffragist Henry Blackwell warned that, quote, "The strength of our opponents consists of the liquor selling and liquor drinking interests." While the alcohol question was not the only problem, the suffrage measure failed. After the national suffragists left town, Colorado suffragists would have to regroup. 3 years later, in 1880, Oregon suffrage experienced a similar defeat, and the first generation of national suffragists quietly closed the door on the West. However, these defeats left room for local and second-generation suffragists to emerge. Like many of her fellow Western suffragists, Carolyn Nichols Churchill was a lot of things: a free love and birth control advocate, a journalist, and a representative of the new woman. This term, new woman, referred to women who no longer only saw themselves, and thereby suffrage, in domestic terms. Instead, Churchill and her other members of the new generation, such as fellow Coloradan Ellis Meredith and rising star Carrie Chapman Catt, were educated, opinionated, independent, and career oriented. While Churchill remained a local force in Colorado, Catt became a dominant voice in the national movement. Catt was born in Ripon, Wisconsin in 1859 and moved to Charles City, Iowa in 1866, where she started school. Initially interested in medicine, Catt convinced her father to allow her to attend the Iowa State Agricultural College, now Iowa State University, a university that had been founded as coeducational in 1859. Upon graduation in 1880 with a Bachelor of Science degree, Catt took a position first as a law clerk and then as a teacher in Mason City, Iowa, where she eventually became the first female superintendent. Catt's first marriage ended after only 1 year when her husband, Leo Chapman, died suddenly of typhoid fever. She returned to Iowa from California, where she eventually married George Catt. It was George, a wealthy engineer, who encouraged her to get involved with women's suffrage and supported her growing travel commitment for the movement. In fact, Carrie Chapman Catt rarely lived with her husband, choosing instead to travel with longtime companion and fellow suffragist Molly Hay. In time, Catt and fellow suffragist Anna Howard Shaw became not only examples of the new woman, but also of new national leadership. They saw the movement in political terms and chose to embrace a whatever means necessary approach to get support from local, state, and national leaders. What this meant was often a subordination of Black women's voices and a belief that the white women's vote would cancel out other possible voters. The new women's independence did not mean that they all held more open views on race, ethnicity, and class, or reasons why white women should get the vote. Catt would eventually become the president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, but in her speeches supporting women's suffrage, she used arguments from evolutionary biology and the emerging concept of social Darwinism to warn against the dangers posed to American democracy by immigrants and Native Americans, like the quote, murderous Sioux. These racist beliefs were not unusual for their time and remind us that very few civil rights movements are truly universalist movements. While Catt developed a national presence, other women, like Carolyn Nichols Churchill, used a similar blend of modern and racist thinking to garner support for women's suffrage. Churchill was a self-described, well-rounded nonconformist whose newspaper, the Queen Bee, declared itself to be a Democratic Republican, greenback know-nothing, pro-China woman suffragist paper. However, when you dig deeper into her pro-China, meaning Chinese immigrants, position, Churchill's support was essentially in support of Chinese men, and more specifically, Chinese men who ran laundries and other businesses that could free up middle-class white women's time for suffrage activities and career pursuits. I bring up the examples of Catt and Churchill not to provide gotcha moments for past suffragists or to hold them up to 21st century racial, ethnic, or religious tolerance standards that most of them wouldn't pass anyway. Instead, it is important to remember that on all scales, national, regional, and local, these women represent versions of the complex reasons that suffragists held for supporting the vote. They give us a clue as to how difficult it is to create a movement for white women in diverse regions and why it's important to look beyond the national activities and examine the regional ones. The West absolutely led the way in extending suffrage at the territorial and state levels, but how Western suffragists did this, often with support from the national leaders and movement, demonstrate the compromises and limitations that suffragists were willing to accept so they could vote. Not everyone wanted the vote for all the same reasons or for all the same people. While the women's suffrage movement can claim roots in the universal suffrage ideology, we must also recognize the movement's racist, anti-immigrant, and classist roots because they affected women then and the movement in the future, even today. Like the West, the Midwest is a region that can boast early suffrage activism and successes. But also like the West, the Midwest state campaigns proved to be more difficult than initially expected and fraught with anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic rhetoric. In considering Midwestern suffrage, I spoke with Dr. Sarah Egge, the Claude D. Pottinger Professor of History at Centre College in Danville, Kentucky. In some ways, the Midwestern suffrage movement, leaders, and associations fit into the national movement, But as Dr. Eggy points out, they also have their regional differences that, like the movement in the West, allow us to see some of the struggles within the movement.
There's certainly things that the Midwestern suffragists share with national leaders. Overall, there's a shared messaging, although there's lots of distinctions in that message. Obviously, women arguing for the right to vote in sort of this kind of idea that women ought to vote because they're equal or because they contribute in some way to the politics that will enhance politics. But then there's really, I think, more distinctions in terms of the Midwest. So, first, in terms of leaders, the leaders in the Midwest were really mostly middle class. Many of them were white, Anglo. So, I don't necessarily mean white in a broad, expansive way. The racial differences were noteworthy at this time in the Midwest. So, people who were suffragists were often Anglo-Saxon and thought of themselves as distinct from maybe other immigrants, especially European immigrants who weren't from countries that had that Anglo-Saxon background. They were typically educated. And then probably the biggest thing that sets them apart, again, it's a small distinction, but it's really important, is that one of the reasons they wanted the right to vote was because they were very involved in their communities. They practiced what I call civic responsibility. So they were, as the Midwest was being settled, they are really the ones, these women, who are building libraries and post offices and schools and churches and public buildings. And so they have it almost like an ownership stake in this region and in their communities. And so they believe very strongly that their community engagement, their civic activism positions them well to then vote. And they also argue, again, in a bit of a distinction, that they don't necessarily want to vote because they believe women are equal. They probably do believe this, they just don't say it. But they really say that they're responsible and they understand the responsibilities of being citizens because they had built up their communities and they had done all the civic activism and community engagement. And so they believed then that the vote was sort of a natural next step as responsible citizens. So that becomes a really important reason, and it's a reason that's distinct to the Midwest as to other regions or from the national suffragists.
Much like the small but important differences in leadership and motivation, the structure and function of the women's suffrage movement also developed differently in the Midwest.
When we think about like how these movements were actually structured in the Midwest, unlike other places, the Midwest is just being settled in the late 19th century. Certainly there were lots of people there before. I don't mean to suggest that there was nothing and then all of a sudden white people show up. That's wrong, of course. But the movement was brought really by these white American settlers. And they really encountered a vast area with little infrastructure, with undeveloped resources, very small populations. And so the methods they had to employ were sort of taking into account that vast, difficult to travel place. And so the train was one way. When there were railroads that were built, then they could take that. But a lot of the context that they made, especially in the late 19th century, really until the advent of automobiles, they were really piecemeal. Mostly when people would hear about suffrage, it was through a newspaper or some sort of pamphlet that would be handed out and passed around. So literature and paper really becomes important when you can't actually have a lot of face-to-face contacts because the settlement has not occurred in a way that allows for that to happen.
Yeah, I really appreciated the ways in which you detailed that the women were really creative in the ways that they reached out to these communities and, having also to take maybe a break for winter, not being able to travel. But it was the creativity that they bring to the movement is quite interesting and enlivening for it.
Right. So they realize that just because it's difficult to travel or because populations are really low and there's still lots of immigration coming to this area at the time, doesn't mean that they can't just not be activists in this place, especially in some of the states where they have a number of amendment campaigns. In South Dakota, for example, the earliest amendment campaign is in 1890, right after the state became a state. And so you have this sort of impulse, this recognition that we can't just abandon this important work. So they do have to be very creative.
For many Midwestern suffragists, The development of a movement paralleled what they had already done and used a creative resourcefulness, the same sense of civic responsibility, to build the movement.
And one of the things that I love is that they infuse it into what they're already doing. So they're building libraries or they're building churches, and then in those same churches, they're hosting suffragists, whichever ones can actually come. But they're able to then sort of transform those spaces that weren't necessarily political spaces, weren't meant, like a church is not necessarily meant to be a political space, but it becomes so when you have lectures or you have meetings or you have just gatherings where people can discuss the issues of the day. The schoolhouse campaigns were incredibly important as well for suffragists. And once again, they're transforming that sort of community activism and engagement that they had as they were building these communities into the sort of suffrage movement. And so, yeah, it's sort of using what you have. And that's really what they had to do.
However, much as we
Oh, that was a snippet of one of the podcasts. That was a lot. Where do we want to start? And again, the name of this particular episode is Regionalism, Race, and the Right to Vote. So that's what we were listening to for those few minutes. Where to begin? Okay, so let me tell you what I heard. That just because something is hard doesn't mean that you just like stop doing it, right? So when something is important to you, you literally find a way to do it. And it was it's so interesting to think of some of the struggles that they had with weather, with infrastructure, with all of these different things that, we don't necessarily even really think about nowadays. But they had to basically mobilize this movement without the modern comforts that we now have.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And we don't necessarily think about stopping a movement because of a season. That just, it's uncomfortable to be outside in the heat. It's, you sometimes have to plan around a snowstorm, but for months on end, if you're snowed in Iowa in the 1880s, 1890s, it actually has a significant impact who's going to gather? How are you getting people together? The logistics that we often kind of take for granted as being solved because we have cars or we have, paved roads or snowplows that come by every once in a while are just not there for them. And Dr. Egge, who's at Center College, goes on to talk about how revolutionary the automobile was, because at that point they didn't have to follow the lines of the trains, that they could go kind of anywhere they wanted. And at that point, they could go to an individual's house that maybe had shown interest in being part of the movement and getting them on board. She also talks about how the foreign languages were kind of an issue, that finding people to speak German or to speak Norwegian or to speak Swedish to their communities. First of all, you had to find people who spoke those languages that were also wanting to be part of the women's suffrage movement. And then also wanting to be a speaker. And speaking in public was still something that was really controversial for women. It was not kind of seen as a very ladylike behavior. It was one that was not prized for women. There was no kind of sense of public speaking developing for women during the time. So there's just a lot of different hurdles that they're having to figure out how to get over that we don't think about. And I think sometimes that's one of the things that I've always appreciated with historians that I've read or talked with, or, seen them in documentaries or on podcasts, is that it's that peeling away of the onion of things that we assume were just kind of there, or that we kind of forgot would have been problems, and presenting them and just really reminding ourselves just how different some of the encounters and the struggles and the problems actually were for people who did make change. And I think you're right, Shanelle, like it's not about giving up, just kind of finding a way to figure it out. And I think probably, even though the circumstances are different, this past year, we've all found ways to do things new things, different things, things that we normally do, but just in new ways entirely. And I think there's a resourcefulness that just kind of comes from the circumstances. So I think they're tapping into that in their moment too.
When Judge Henry, it looked like you wanted to say something.
I just was going to ask, like, was there any obstacle as far as like, were the men supportive of it? If you said, you know, if you're a married woman and you say, hey, I'm going to go to this church or schoolhouse to meet with a bunch of women about, you know, women's voting, you know, was that an issue then where there were, you know, husbands, dads who didn't want you involved? And so was there, did you have to sneak around to go to the...
Yeah, I mean, that does become an issue. I mean, not everybody has a husband like Carrie Chapman Catt who's like, okay, see you in 11 months after you've got on this big campaign. Yeah, I mean, that is an issue. A lot of what the Midwestern women are doing are couching it in terms of responsible citizenship. As Dr. Egge mentioned, that they are building the infrastructure of their community in a way that is very communally focused. And so to deny them access to a continuation of that would, for a lot of those families, would not have, that actually would have been seen as kind of the unnatural thing. But you have generations of women who are being raised by parents, both mothers and fathers, who don't want to see them voting. In fact, in 1920, the majority of women didn't support suffrage. So, I mean, there's just this wide variety of people and their reaction. A lot of times suffrage is part of a larger citizenship or larger kind of community campaign. And so it's kind of buried in. They're not talking as stridently about rights and votes, but about participation. And it just kind of gets shuttled in that way. But you have people who are having to make choices about whether or not they want to abide by their family's wishes or their husband's wishes to participate. And if they're married and their husband doesn't approve or doesn't want you to participate, you really don't have a lot of recourse. I mean, the divorce is very limited. You have to, there's no fault divorce at this point. And so if you got divorced, you were more than likely not going to have anything, including your children. And so the stakes of kind of violating that severe disapproval would be quite high. And I think things that a lot of women would have to kind of consider. But you also have men who are part of this these organizations in this movement. I think it's important to note that and to continue to applaud when men get to be part of the women's movement. It's necessary for them to be participants. And so you do have men who come on board who are maybe the second person in the family that gets excited about suffrage, but then because they are part of the suffrage movement, are able to kind of spread the word and get out and about. And men have access to public spaces at this time that women just don't. And so being able to enter into some of those public spaces, maybe not to recruit women. I mean, you're not going to be recruiting a lot of women in places that women don't usually go to, but, you know, going into restaurants, going into bars, going into places of work, and really kind of talking about it allows them to be part of the movement as well. But yeah, if you're not part of a family that wants you to be a suffragist, you're going to have to make some hard choices. And I think a lot of times there's a reason that civil rights movements are so highly populated by young people, because they haven't tied their lives into spouses and jobs and children, and the ability to make some of those choices, while still hard, can be made a little bit easier.
So it's like you don't have as much to lose, right? And there's really no one to kind of answer to in a way. Yeah. To where you can literally lose everything that you all have built.
Yeah.
So we have a question that's on the screen. Can you see the question?
Yes.
I can read it as well.
All right. I'll go ahead and read it. Is there a lack of masculine support concerning the women's movement now? And what can be done to get more men, husbands to support? That is a great question.
It's my husband. I just wanted to tell you that that's my husband. Okay, go ahead.
I would say yes and no. I mean, I think that I think in the general population, I think men have a very misguided understanding about what the women's movement is. And so it gets tied up into what feminism is, which has also been misunderstood. And I think a lot of times it's this sense of it's about women, it's not about me. And I think really one of the best ways, and I mentioned this at the talk that I gave to the Rotary Club on Tuesday, starting to talk about all sorts of things as women's issues. And so foreign policy, public policy, economic issues are all women's issues in a certain way. And so talking about the ways in which men and women's lives intersect is a great way of seeing how men are actually also affected. I mean, the big thing that is driving this is a patriarchal system that actually does as much harm to men as it does to women. It reduces the amount of emotions that men are allowed to express. So the same system that doesn't want to see strong women speaking out also doesn't want to see men crying in public. And I think that inability to see the full range of human emotion and the full range of human capacity is one in which both men and women benefit from participating in the women's movement. That they can, to be seen as an ally, I think is really cool. I mean, my husband's a feminist, and it was one of the most attractive things about him is that it's just this natural sense with him that it's not or that it's something that he's willing to listen to. I think one of the things that men often ask, and I think it's in this question as well, is how to support people. And I think a lot of it is listening to people's perspective, listening to the ways in which, if somebody has the same job as you, they might not have the same experiences as you do. And really believing that somebody's experiences that they're having aren't just them having a bad day, but maybe something a little bit deeper, that something else is going on that might be more systemic versus just, you're dealing, with a colleague that's kind of just a jerk. I'm like, well, what allows that to exist?
Yeah. So, well, number one, I want to acknowledge that we have someone, Patricia, who is loving this conversation. So I wanted to put that on the screen. And I also, you hit on many different things, but the word that you used was ally, which we've heard a lot over this past year. I think people have more of an understanding of what that means. And you defined it perfectly. You said an ally is someone who is able to go into spaces that you're not able to go into and basically spread the message in a way that people necessarily wouldn't hear from someone who isn't like them. And so, we've talked a lot about just racial allies, being a racial and anti-racist, and then being also a woman's ally. And, you were just talking about just looking at the different experiences. And I'm thinking back to just my time in the courthouse and how there was always like this interesting line with certain judges where you couldn't know too much, but you can't, you have to know enough to where they know that you're competent. And so it's like this weird line that you have to kind of balance as a female attorney as you're advocating for your client. And so that's not something, I think sometimes it's hard to articulate some of the undefined or things that, are difficult to describe, things that we have to do in order to kind of move things forward in a way.
Yeah, and just think about that example. That's a great one, because think about how much time and effort you spent trying to figure out that line, that perfect, never going to quite Goldilocks line with this person. I think, we have an idea that somehow a racist or a misogynist is somebody who does like these really big actions, like it's the guy in the white suit burning a cross on your lawn, or it's the person that's, you know, calling out names to women on the streets. It's actually, you know, it's the subtler things, it's the small things that take so much time and energy out of a person's day to deal with, that kind of grate you down on a regular basis, that I think we also have to address. Yes, it's bad to have these large things happen, and I think we have somewhat of a legal structure to at least bring that to the attention. Sometimes, you know, see justice, not as often as would be nice, but you know, just the idea of being in a meeting and being talked over, or giving an idea and then it being ignored until a man voices the same idea. And I see some smiling faces with this idea of this has happened and this is not an uncommon thing. And then the rest of your day, you're in a crappy mood because this happened and you're kind of fuming. And what could you have done with the rest of your day if you didn't have to kind of continually replay that in your head? And I think one of the things that I always tell men and male colleagues that I work with is like, just, you know, if you see that happening, just because it's not happening to you, step in and say, you know, I think actually that was, you know, Shanelle's idea. Let's hear more about it from her. Or, you know, I actually think Renee was talking. I think that we need to kind of get back to what she was saying. And that's hard to do. I'm a really, really shy person. So stepping in like that is counter to every fiber of my personality, except the part of me that thinks that all of those things are really terrible and wrong. And so I have to have that part kick in to intervene. And it's uncomfortable because you're calling somebody out. I mean, you're doing it publicly. You're not maybe making a big scene, but nobody likes to have negative attention drawn to them. And so it can be uncomfortable. But I think those types of little things, or men showing up to women's marches. Like if you know that there's a women's event going on, it's not just about your wives or your girlfriends or your sisters. It's about you. And so you can attend. Or coming to something like this. Having your male children sign up for a women's history class is not a bad thing. My classes generally are fairly mixed until I teach women's history, and then it's like all women, and then like the one guy who sticks it out through the semester who's like totally awesome. But it's a weird dynamic. And it gets a little bit insidery. There was one time a young man, very smart and just really a good person, just kind of raised his hands at something and he was like, what are Spanx? And so it was just like, it's a totally different vibe when you don't have a mixed gender. And I don't have it in any other class besides women's history. So I think it's stepping into spaces that are not your own and being the listener and the learner and the person who is there to figure out how you might actually fit in. I think one of the problems sometimes with the internet is that everything gets so algorithmed into exactly who you are. Like Amazon has figured out exactly what book you want to read next, or
it's
what.
So weird. It's so weird. It's so weird.
I feel like it's a personal triumph when Amazon gets me wrong. I'm like, I would never read that book. But yeah, it is really weird. But I think that means that we're not encountering a lot of people or ideas or just products that are not our own. And so I think that can be really hard, especially in a pandemic when we're also not supposed to be encountering people on a regular basis.
Right. Well, I want to just open it up and see if there are any other questions. And it looks like we have another one that popped on the screen. But anyone on the screen, does anyone on the screen have a question?
Well, I don't have a question. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Sorry, I don't have a question, but when you was talking about the subtleties, I think sometimes when the subtle kind of putting people down, or kind of, as Shanelle was speaking about the subtle way the judge will respond to a female lawyer. I think that can cause the most damage because the way you respond to it can get more of a reaction than you actually wanted. So say if I say, well, I'm offended by that because I was actually one where she's not a team player. So then you have those judgmental moments that come in that can cause more damage than you actually thought would even happen when you addressed it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in particular in cases where, you're talking to somebody who is specifically your supervisor or on that supervisory level that can then evaluate you. I mean, we're all in this kind of track of being evaluated annually. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of times women get comments about how they're not collegial. And that's usually because they've spoken up about something like that. Or, they're soft spoken because they're not like aggressively attacking, the conversation. And so it can be actually really jeopardizing. And you have to think in your mind, is it worth it? Is it worth getting potentially dinged? And I can't fault somebody who doesn't want to lose their job because they don't want to point out that this person who's, made a really damaging comment or just kind of dismissed them. I mean, who wants to lose their livelihood, their income, and their stability over that? But I agree. I think it's those small things are sometimes the most damaging. And they're also the most difficult to prove that there was any intent behind it.
Yeah. Yeah, the implicitness, the implicit biases, right? Those small slights that, paper cuts hurt though.
Yeah, especially if you get them in the thousands.
Absolutely.
And implicit bias is bias, it may be implicit, it may be explicit, but it's bias.
Yeah.
And I would just piggyback off of Tina's remarks. I am guilty of that. I play the game. I have done it my whole career and it has helped me. Absolutely. Good old boy network, I'm going to fit right in and I'm not going to cause any waves and I'm not going to say anything that will jeopardize my standing in the courtroom. And that's not right. It's just not right. You got to stand up for what's wrong. And I've been a part of hearing things against women, against minorities, against people who can't stick up for themselves. And I'm just sitting there smiling because I don't want to get dinged. So I appreciate what you said, Tina, and that's something that I'm really trying to work on in my own life and my own recognition of biases.
Yeah. It takes a lot of courage though, and it's
absolutely.
And sometimes things just happen in the moment. I've had things, people have said things just in the moment and it literally takes you, you're shocked.
Yeah. And that's a lot of my problem is I'm just so shocked. Did they really just say that?
They really just say that.
And how do I react except for smile and kind of back off? Sometimes I'm ready for a fight, but usually I'm just complicit.
And I think
and I think I'm probably the exact opposite. I'm probably the one that's going to be the most loudest or aggressively respond, and that's a negative on another way too, because then you're looked at as that angry woman
Absolutely.
Or angry whatever that's going on at the time. So to have that balancing act, and just to know, even back when the suffrage was going on, there was women that were willing to sacrifice everything so that we could have the rights we have now. So I think there's a time to respond and a time to not, but there are definitely times to say enough is enough. And so,
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just these women were so bold. They were so bold. They were so forward thinking in fighting for something that so many people were against, and what they probably lost as a result of it. I'm just very grateful that there are people that are built like that. And this is the thing. It's different people had different roles. Not everyone is responsible for everything, but everyone can do something, right? Everyone can do something.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important message that there are people who are Susan B. Anthony was basically just energy going forward for her whole life. I mean, she doesn't marry. She is constantly involved in reform movement. She starts out as an abolitionist and moves into suffrage. But I mean, she is the organizer. She is the mastermind behind, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton is the kind of intellect. They're both very smart, but she's the intellectual, she's the speaker. And so they're just kind of blazing forward. And then you have people in these, you know, small towns and these communities that are, you know, maybe sacrifice, you know, they're married, they have children, they have their own lives, but they also sacrifice, you know, an evening a week, or, you know, women are really good at hiding what they're really doing. Like they put together like these, it would basically be now like a craft fair that raises money for suffrage. So they're making all of these feminine products, like not hygiene products, but like quilts and pies, and they're, you know, donating recipes, and, you know, they're making aprons to sell, and all of these things that look like, oh, we're just doing, and it's for women's suffrage. And you're just thinking like, I think it shows that there isn't that dichotomy between like, you have to be, you know, like ultra masculine or kind of, you know, a feminine woman. You know, feminists can bake as well, if that's a skill that you have. Non-feminists can burn their house down trying to bake too. So, I mean, it just kind of, you know, it's just kind of a thing. But I think that ability to just kind of like sneak in what they're doing. And then, as Dr. Eggy mentioned, put it in a capsule of like, this is citizenship. This is us participating. This isn't anything outside of what we've been doing before. We just now want it legal.
So that's really, they branded it. So that's like our term for branding, right? They wanted the right to vote, but I think they probably had to talk about it in a different way. Yeah. So that, and I actually want to put another comment on here, which I think really speaks to some of the pain points or some of the fears that our male counterparts may have or may experience, which if you could read that, or I can read it for you, that Patricia is asking.
Yeah, with supportive husbands, how can we as women help the man understand we are not trying to take over, but trying to move in our lives as they move in theirs? And this is a great question, because this in many ways deals both with rights and with privileges. And what is really important to articulate is that what women are wanting is the equal rights. And unfortunately, what some of that is going to mean is that male privilege in space, privilege in kind of assumption of what types of jobs or how much money they're going to make, some of those privileges are going to go away. But to kind of start to understand that there might be some pain in that. I mean, I don't want privilege taken away, but there's ways in which I understand that my privilege is making my life less comfortable. So that question of, okay, well, at what point do you start stripping it away yourself? Because it needs to be removed in order for other people to have equal access. But I think in terms of talking about it with husbands or spouses who want to be supportive, it's really about rights. And I think the idea of being able to go to your job and not feel that you are being kind of constantly nitpicked or persecuted. Kind of just one of the things that my husband has told me that kind of has been eye-opening for him is just listening to my day-to-day talk about my job or my interactions with people or interactions with students, and just kind of learning how people treat me in the world. I think sometimes just letting people know what it's like day to day can give people an idea that it's not like you want to remove all men from working spaces, but that it's being able to move in. I think, in the last 5 years, we've all been subject to either listening to, reading, or having people talk about that book, Lean In. The idea that women just have to lean in. Lean into what? Lean into being men? I think, Betsy, you talked about how kind of being part of the boys club. Well, that's one way of doing it. And I think for some people, that's a personality that might naturally fit them. But is that something that we all need to do? Do we all need to lower our voices in order for men to naturally hear them, which is an actual thing that men have been told that they hear voices that are lower as smarter and more like informative than high-pitched voices. So, I mean, just like recognizing that leaning in is actually just kind of leaning into a very narrow vision, I think is not particularly helpful for all women. But I think kind of just incorporating your husband or your partner into the day-to-day conversations. And so when it does get to a larger issue on women's issues, I think one of the things that we've learned about in the pandemic is that the infrastructure that has been set up for women in order for them to work is basically just kind of held together with glue, hope, and thread.
Terrible.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
And so as people, I saw my friends, and I'm sure a number of you were homeschooling and cooking and trying to work yourself. And, you know, it was always really funny when, you know, you'd see these Zoom calls with kids interrupting, but I think that became an everyday occurrence during this past year. And just how do we not have that happen? Obviously, once we get out of the pandemic, what is it that really is necessary for that not to happen? One of the kind of sad statistics is that this is a women's recession. The pandemic recession is a women's recession, that women are the ones who are making the choices to not go and continue work because they have to stay home and take care of their families, or because they are the ones that have the high contact job. And so they might be coming into kind of areas and spaces where they wouldn't then be able to comfortably go home to their families. And I think not having a support system within our communities for that not to happen is an argument and a conversation that men and women need to be part of. So learning about the everyday activities, I think, can be a really enlightening way for men to figure out really what it's like to live as a woman. They don't need to go full bosom buddies and dress as women and trying to figure it out. But, you know, just kind of listening to the people around them and getting them, invite them places too. I mean, how many of us go to things because people invite us versus the bombarding of, oh, all of these events are coming my way and I maybe sign up for like a third of them. I mean, you can't do everything, but, you know, invite men to come with you. You know, they might turn you down. They might say, well, I have something else I'd rather do. But if you invite them, they at least know the door is open. And then maybe afterwards they'd say, oh, hey, how was it? And so kind of opening those doors in those conversations, because men truly are allies. If you are partnered with somebody, probably you are partnered with somebody who loves you and, you know, kind of has the best interests at heart for you. And so having those conversations shouldn't be something that is hard necessarily. It might be awkward at first because they're not used to talking about it. It kind of depends what they're used to. But I think including men in the conversation always is such a really important point, instead of just saying, all right, now it's a voting year, you've got to vote all of these different ways for women's issues. Well, in the conversation.
Yeah. So something that I have seen, and I do want to ask you another question, but something that I've seen, which I think is something else, is when you have households of folks that say, basically, you know, I'm the man, I'm voting this way, you have to vote the same way that I'm voting. Yeah. I think that concept is just so foreign to me. But it just, I just wonder how much of that was happening when women were granted the right to vote. So it's like kind of the thought process of, okay, well, yeah, we got an extra vote, but you have to vote how I vote so that we can get our candidate in and type thing.
Yeah. And I think one of the really, you know, big questions is, oh my God, what are they going to do with a vote? And in some cases, the very first thing that women do, to be quite honest, because this is also the time of temperance, they outlaw alcohol, which is like, what did we just do? But yeah, I mean, the question of how they're going to vote, and, you know, women didn't actually radically change politics in any era. And in fact, white women always vote for the more conservative candidate, always. And so if you see statistics about how women voted in a certain way, and it's not for the more conservative candidate, it's usually women of color who have voted so extraordinarily high percentage-wise for the other candidate, who are pulling that woman vote along. So the first round of voters are not doing anything really radical.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, there's now conversations about what women are going to be voting like. And for those who, there was a strong anti-suffrage campaign, and their argument was, I already have 5 votes. I have a husband and 4 sons, and I tell them what's what, and I tell, I'm the, in my big fat Greek wedding, he's the head, but I'm the neck. The idea that I steer the family was something that a lot of women really felt, that they were engaged in these civic conversations and they didn't need a single vote because they had, however many male relatives they had in their family, they were convinced that they were convincing them how to vote. And why would you give that privilege up just to then cast your own vote? Not that you couldn't still talk to your husbands and your fathers and your sons, but the idea that I already have 5 votes, what's another one going to do? Was really something. Yeah, most women did not want the vote at the time.
So that was like a whole other battle then. So it's not just the men, right? It's the women. It's the women. So convincing them. What I was going to ask, and I definitely want to make sure folks feel comfortable with asking whatever questions that you have, is how would you connect what was happening then to what's happening now? So when I look at the women's suffrage movement, and I look at issues with what I would call voter suppression that are happening, basically making it more difficult for people to vote, do you see any connections or I don't know if you have any thoughts about that or if you've thought about that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think we heard a little bit of it in the podcast, is that a lot of these women actually don't want all women to vote. They're very invested in voter suppression in a lot of ways. They're interested in having their vote counteract male Black men, immigrant men. There's really kind of a tacit agreement by the time you get to 1920, when President Woodrow Wilson is now officially on board in 1918 to support a federal amendment and helps get it passed. It's really kind of understood that it's a federal amendment that's not going to change the way that the 15th Amendment is enforced. And the 15th Amendment recognizes African-American men as voters. And so there's a lot of conversation actually around voter suppression. This is not necessarily the kind of civil rights moment that I think a lot of people really wanted it to be. And that's been one of the struggles this past year is, yes, you want to celebrate this thing that has happened 100 years. And it's, we don't have that many of them. And so amendments are important, especially when they deal with suffrage. But I think the idea that this was the watershed, that all of a sudden all the women are able to vote, all the women are running out into the streets and voting, it's just not true. And I think that's been one of the things that, for me as a historian, has been most interesting to discuss. But I think for a lot of people has also been a little bit sad that you have these impressions of these women that maybe you did a project on in grade school or high school, that are these fantastic suffragists that also had these really racist ideas that you're now learning about, and how to kind of, and I mean, they're women of their time, which is the ultimate, well, they're okay over there. But I think we're all people of our times. We all hold the prejudices and biases and racism and misogyny that kind of infuse our society. And I think it's hard to get away from that. And they do it a little bit better than others at times, and then sometimes they're just really terrible at it.
Yeah, it's something though, because they were of their time, but then they weren't, right? So they recognized the importance of women, white women, middle class white women having the right to vote. and having that civic responsibility, but we're blinded to the others, essentially. But it's not as if the others, right, so women of color and folks with lower economic status weren't screaming and saying, hey, we have issues that aren't being addressed. And so I believe I was listening to a little further along, and there were other kind of movements that were happening within the movement.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you get African-American women are on it. They are forming organizations. And, you know, Black women had been part of the women's suffrage conversation. Sojourner Truth was at some of the very first women's suffrage conventions. Frederick Douglass was part of the first one in Seneca Falls in 1848. So they had been part of the conversation, but their interests and their needs had never been part of the main message. And so there was this sense that they both wanted to be part of the organization. So they didn't want to just completely leave the organizations, to leave these women to like not think at all about race or about economic issues. But they also realized that being part of the larger organizations meant that their ideas, their thoughts, their needs weren't being addressed in the sophisticated, necessary, immediate way. And so you have the Alpha Suffrage Association, you have the Chicago Women's Voting Club, you have just a number of different organizations. And really, by the early part of the 20th century, while the National Women's Suffrage Association has kind of moved its headquarters to New York City, Washington, D.C. becomes the hub for Black suffrage. And Ida B. Wells Barnett, who is just a powerhouse of her own in a number of different fields. She's a journalist. She writes a lot about segregation. She writes this really amazing pamphlet on the horrors of lynching. She presses Congress to pass an anti-lynching law the entire time that she's alive, and it doesn't actually ever go through. It made it to the House. It made it to the House a couple of years ago. So we're still in this period, but you have women who are looking at the lives of African-American women. And again, there's class stratations between working class and middle class African-American women that are not also addressing each other in terms of similar groups. And you have working class women who see that their need for worker safety and kind of higher wages is a central component. One of the largest kind of tragedies of the early 20th century is actually the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire in 1911. You have almost 150 women or 150 people who die. Most of them are young immigrant women. There are these rooms that are just packed, sewing machine to sewing machine, filled with young women. And they're locked in because the manager thinks they're taking too many bathroom breaks, and the building catches on fire. And they're high enough up that the fire trucks and their ladders and the water can't get up to the top. They're trying to escape down the elevator, which we all now know you should not use during a fire. And they're like trying to escape. And some of them are jumping out the window, and they're 10 stories up. And so this is a circumstance in which the middle class advocacy for, I want greater access to the professions, or I want the ability to vote, doesn't really cover what they're experiencing. And so the ability to have, I mean, the state legislature and the city council pass fire escape, sprinkler laws. They do a whole lot of redesign on buildings, requiring things for workers to be able to leave safely and not die. But it's those types of issues, class-based, racially based issues, that the national movement isn't identifying. And so they form their own. And these are dynamic groups in the same ways that we talk about kind of the national women's suffrage movement. They hold conventions, they circulate petitions, they hold activities, they are out there as much as white middle class women. They are speaking to their communities, but they're also trying to speak at the larger organizational meetings as well to get their issues on the table of the national movement. But by the time the 19th Amendment is passed, it's basically been understood that where Black men can vote in the United States, so mostly in the North and in the West, Black women are going to be able to vote there. But if there's a segregation law, if there are, laws forbidding kind of if your grandfather couldn't vote, or your ability to pass a test or pay a poll tax, those are going to apply to Black women too. And so there's a real sense that this is not the amendment that everybody thought it was going to be. And so they just keep pushing through 1920s and 30s. In future episodes, there's a lot of, there's an interview with Dr. Kiana Irwin at University of Missouri, and she talks about the economic issues that women bring to their civil rights movement in the 1930s. And kind of economic rights in St. Louis becomes really kind of where the nexus of women's activism becomes. But there are women all over the country that are making names for themselves, either within their racial or ethnic group, or within their kind of economic enclave, or within their region, that we just don't all know about. And I think that was one of the fun things doing this podcast, and then also participating in these year-long conversations, is that everybody's unearthing or revealing all of these people. And so just kind of exchanging ideas of these hundreds and hundreds of women who made contributions to the women's movement overall. And it becomes a much more diverse and dynamic place, and a place where not everybody's getting along, but they're all wanting suffrage in some way.
I think it's interesting, kind of going back a little to talking about, having to play the game, and you figure out when to speak up and when to be more subtle about things. And I thought it was interesting in your podcast, and I have like a transcript because I learned better reading, so I was kind of looking at it. But
you did. That's cheating.
I know. It's not cheating. But I think it's interesting how it seems like they were so political even then, so politically savvy, and kind of like, okay, well, in our area, we think if we put it this way, we're more likely to get votes. And in this area, if we put it this way, we're more likely to get votes. Like with the Temperance and the National Association saying, no, get away from that. But the locals saying, no, this is what we think is gonna get us the vote, which then failed. They were wrong. But
yeah.
So it, like, how long have women been having to play this game of, just give us a little here, versus the also being like very strong and loud and angry about things, and trying to get any of those to work?
For a very long time is the answer. I mean, if you, there's a really great historian who in the 1990s expanded the definition of politics. And then what we normally think about of politics is basically interaction with the government and voting. She's like, okay, that's part of it. But there's also the politicking that goes on behind it. And that can be a number of things, including all of the different techniques that women in the 19th and 20th century were using. So petitioning, having conversations, holding conventions. But then you even have, going further back, like during the American Revolution, there was a boycott on tea and imported fabrics. So homespun fabrics, which Benjamin Franklin wore. And he basically looked, those pieces of clothing that make you look like you're in a dystopian movie where things have gone bad, but now everybody wears the same things. That's kind of what the homespun clothing looked like in the 18th century. It's not particularly flattering, but that was the point in some ways, to distinguish it from something that you would have imported from England. But it's women who are kind of making the choices or enforcing the ban on tea, on sugar. So, we all live in neighborhoods. We kind of know what's going on in people's homes. If you saw me unloading like a big, gigantic box of tea into my house, you'd be like, oh my God, did you see what Robin did? She bought tea. And then you could ostracize me and make me feel shunned and not part of the community. If my husband has a business, you just decide not to buy stuff from him. And so there's ways of putting pressure on people that women have been doing. Gossip, I always tell students, is the language of people who are oppressed. Gossip is a way for people who are more vulnerable to have conversations in avenues and ways in which they are not always party. We often think about gossip as from the top down, but it is very much also from the bottom up. And so the ways in which gossip and rumors are used, you can use them strategically to try to, pinpoint somebody as a sugar user, or somebody who wore fancy clothes or bought tea, or, was somebody who, in the language of Temperance, supported and bought alcohol. Women who were temperance advocates were fierce. I mean, they were, in Wichita, we have the monument of monuments to Carrie Nation, who took an axe to, the Eaton Hotel's beautiful wooden bar, but then also spilled all the alcohol out into the streets. So the idea of women not being political until they got the right to vote or could be elected to office is just, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And the ways that women have been interacting with each other have been much more kind of emblematic of politicking. And so it's not as if women naturally have the skills to enter into the realm of official politics always, but there are places where they can learn them. And in many ways, the women's rights movement in the 19th and early 20th century allows for a little bit of that space. So they're engaging with politicians. They are talking in front of people. They're talking in front of mixed crowds of people that may or may not be on their side. They're speaking to newspapers. They're speaking to kind of people in communities that they're not familiar with. And I think those are the skills that women are learning as they're moving through these movements. But, it's this whole wealth of softer power, ways in which people have interacted with each other that builds up to a more formal view of politics. And that's where you can see women really kind of engaging and interacting.
You were talking, and when you were talking about ostracizing people and not supporting their business, I immediately was like, oh, that's cancel culture, right? That's what happens now. When someone says something or does something that the masses don't agree with, there's this move to, remove them.
Yeah. And it's so easy now with the internet that you can just, pinpoint somebody and say, okay, I'm not going there. Or, just in a slower way, you can look over kind of the business practices of a company or corporation and say, okay, well, I want to hire them for this. Do they support the same things that I do or my organization does? And so, ways that are both kind of hot in the moment and then kind of calmer, you can kind of figure out. But yeah, I mean, it's very similar to kind of the idea of, holding somebody accountable for what they're doing and, saying, all right, I'm going to tell people who you are, and then everybody around you gets to decide, but I'm going to be really strongly in favor of nobody coming to your shop because I saw you buy something that you shouldn't have.
So I've never heard gossip described how you just described it.
Yeah.
Is that something that your students they have an aha moment or oh, wow, I didn't really connect that?
Yeah, I think we often think about it as something that people with a lot of power do to people who are beneath them. And that absolutely happens. But there's also this type of gossip in which if you don't have actual avenues into the conversation, gossip is a way of kind of leaping over some of that maybe some of the more salacious things that you're saying are actually going to make it into the mainstream of the conversation. And maybe some of the things that you are saying are going to put somebody kind of on the back foot. Maybe they're going to be somebody who is no longer welcomed into an organization or a community. And you didn't vote them out, but you spread enough gossip around to where people did it for you, I guess. So, I mean, there's ways that gossip can be used as a tool. It's never one that I tell students, like, go out and gossip. But I think it is important to realize that there are ways in which, if you don't have access to the main avenues of power, conversation, and legal rights, that you have to express all of those in some way, and you have to figure out how it's being expressed. And rumor and gossip, for people in the lower classes, people who are removed from the political or legal conversation, so for a long period of time, African Americans or women, often have these networks of gossip that are under the radar. In some cases, they're actually spreading good information. So they're maybe telling you about someone, oh, hey, this is going to happen, you might want to stay away. So rumor and gossip are kind of connected in all ways. Gossip has a little bit more of a negative connotation. Rumor has that possibility for it not being true in a greater sense. But both are being used to both transmit information as a warning and also transmit information in a way that might actually get what you would like to do if you had a legitimate vote done. So accusing somebody of a crime or kind of passing secrets about them is a way of kind of ever so slightly taking hits at their character that even in the 18th and 19th century has merit. Absolutely. Still happens today, is the comment on the screen. And so it is important to see it both as something that people from above and below are using. They're not always using it on the same issues or at the same time, but it's something that isn't just happening. And I always want my students to see the choices that people are making as kind of what they are. Like, what choices do they actually have? What choices do they legitimately have access to? And then how are they choosing to kind of move about in that universe? Not everybody has the same choices available to them. And at times, gossip and rumor can get a little bit more done if you don't have a political or legal voice. Again, I don't advocate it in my class because then we're all going down. But yeah, it can be a very powerful tool.
Man, that I mean, I just have so many different connection points. So this makes me think about when we heard a lot about the Me Too movement, but specifically in Hollywood, how they would talk about how everyone kind of knew who to stay away from, who was doing what. And I think it's in any community, like, you know, who not to hang around at that after hours gathering because they get a little handsy or whatever the case may be. There's always that spreading and sharing of information that happens. I don't know if I would call it gossip or rumor. If it's true, it's true. Like, this is information that is.
Truth is always a defense, Shanelle, you know.
You said what now?
The truth is always a defense, right?
Just saying. Good stuff. Any other comments?
My problem is sometimes that person is me. I have fun. No.
Oh, that is hilarious.
Betsy's a hugger.
That is lit. Robin, is there anything else that you wanted to highlight or share with us?
I guess one of the things that I get asked a lot is, what can we do today? Like, this is history, and history doesn't necessarily have to teach us like direct lessons of what we need to be doing today. But I think in a movement where it doesn't feel done, where it, the passage of the 19th Amendment, its ratification, that is finished, but there's still voter suppression. There's still ways in which there's even kind of softer power of voter intimidation, that, there are laws that are being passed, but then there's ways that people can manipulate the circumstance that is more intimidating, makes it more intimidating to vote or more difficult to vote. My voting precinct got combined with another one. And now if I want to vote before class, I have to get up very early the day of. So like that is, that can be a form of voter intimidation. But I think just kind of the conversation of what can we do today? And I think really, 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 it has to be about kind of all the things that we've talked about tonight of like getting together and listening to each other's experiences and believing people when they're telling you things. I think that's one thing that is always really hard, because if somebody else is telling you an experience that isn't like your own, our first inclination is sometimes to say, well, I've never had that happen. I'm like, well, of course you haven't. You're not me. Or, you're not, there are a number of things in which I have more obstacles than you to this, and not necessarily seeing it as a competition, but kind of just learning about what it's like to be in somebody else's existence. And that could be based on skin color or class background. It could be, having a family with a lot of young kids, or having, being a single person. I think one of the things that we haven't talked a lot about, honestly, during this pandemic is singleness, because I cannot even imagine singleness during the pandemic. I mean, I know what my single friends have been doing, and a lot of it has been just kind of forming friend pods. But, I was single until I was 40, and being sick sucked. Prior to like ordering groceries online, which I think is like the best thing that has happened in the pandemic in my life, is just the groceries appear. And they don't. A kind person who's probably being paid way too little to do this is doing it. But the idea of going to the grocery store when you're sick is now, we discourage that. But I think also, who wants to do that when you have a fever? Like that feeling of being ill. If I'm ill enough not to teach or not to be at work, like I'm in my bed. And if I don't have enough food, if I didn't plan for catching the flu, that sucks. And I think that sense of like not knowing what another person's experience is like can be blinding. And it's completely understandable why we don't. Our lives are so busy and so packed that it's hard to, make time to see other people's points of view, or really kind of sit down and think about another person's existence. But that everything that you want in your life is not always what somebody else wants, I think is a really important element. And then kind of asking, well, how do we get to a place where maybe both can exist? Or, hey, I've never thought about, childcare issues as being, an essential part of women and really families' existence, or that women's jobs are so very contingent on there being childcare options. How can I step in the mix of that? So I think just kind of asking questions, and then invite people to do things with you. Invite people, like, tonight, I know that Renee and Shanelle went around the neighborhood. They mentioned that they had passed out flyers. You've made it kind of public on Facebook or in other forums. Doing things like that can be really important, because it reaches out just beyond your friend network and into, still networks that you're in community with, you're in, the neighborhood. But it just reaches that one step beyond. And then maybe once that person is in your friend network or in your community network, maybe they reach a little bit beyond. And I think it's just that idea of inviting people over. I mean, right now is not a really good time, but inviting people to do things, inviting people. And, I invite people all the time to come to things and to do things with no expectation. It's just, hey, there's this event and it's happening. And, I at one point had a friend who was like, oh my God, you keep inviting me to stuff. I feel so nervous and sad that I can't go. I'm like, no, I'm just telling you what's happening. Like, I'm not like taking off like your friendship quota because you've gone to a certain number of events. Like, this is just something that I'm doing. Hey, you want to come with me? Or, hey, this might be interesting for you too. And I think it's that level of community, because as we notice in the podcast tonight, that's what the women in the 19th century are doing. They are forming community through the people that they know. It's not as if they all know or even meet Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but they all know each other, or they all kind of engage when a woman comes and, Carrie Chapman Catt goes around and talks with, different women's groups. They all really do, but they get further and further west, and they get deeper and deeper into rural areas that I think is really important. And I think we can do that as people, as women, as communities. We can go into each other's lives and not intervene in a kind of tactical, aggressive way, but intervene by just inviting people to do stuff.
I think it's really powerful. Like tonight, just our little group here that we're all talking to, we're kind of doing what they were doing. And you see, we had a couple questions where clearly a common theme is how do we get men involved? How do we get men to understand our point of view and what we need and why it's important? And so I think it's just so powerful that we could, come together and still move the movement forward, I guess, from being able to connect and just talk about those issues.
Yeah. I mean, share podcasts, not just mine, but, share books, share ideas. And I'm not ashamed to say that I have trapped people in my car with me and be like, hey, I'm listening to this really great book. Do you mind if we continue on? And it's like something that, I think that they need to hear. So when I go and get my vaccine, I'm listening to a number of anti-racist books. And so I'll be like, hey, let's just continue on to this. Or like, I'll just leave the radio on and it just plays for a little bit. And, with fingers crossed that this is another way to slowly intervene in people's lives. It's hard to intervene sometimes. The 70-plus-year-old crowd has their thoughts. But, it's ways in which you can just kind of, without being like hyperly confrontational all the time. There are moments to be confrontational. There are just moments where the line in the sand has to be drawn. But, just starting the conversation or revealing or listening to things, because a lot of times is, I've never thought about it that way. How many times have we heard that statement? Like, I've never thought about that. Or, oh my goodness, that's not, yeah, of course. And it seems so common sense after you hear it, but you've not thought about it before.
Well, I was just going to say, not to get too deep, but I think that is an issue that we're facing, that people, like, they want to know something so bad that they just stick to their thought process, that when something new is introduced that they haven't heard before or haven't been exposed to before, they immediately reject it. And so instead of being open to listening and understanding and then assessing whether, okay, is this a conspiracy theory that I do need to reject? Or is this something that is going to add value to my life and change my perspective and grow me as a person? I think the misconception is that after you get a certain age, you just stop growing, you stop learning, you stop being able to experience new things. And we just don't. We're always learning.
Yeah. And I think it is the capacity and the desire to do that kind of keeps people going. And for me, I think one of the benefits of being a teacher is being a professor is like being able to share that with students. But one of the frustrating points is I don't know where it goes. Like, I've had students come up and tell me after class, like, I have never heard a professor talk about race the way that you do, or I've never heard about the history of gay rights before your class. And those are really great compliments. But at the same time, there's probably a lot more people in the class who something stuck with them and they're never going to tell me. Like, it planted a seed, it's needling through their brain, it's going someplace, and Christmas break is happening, and then I never see them, and then they hear something again. Mm-hmm. It's often that second or third exposure that gets people thinking, and nobody likes to be confronted. Like, confrontation is sometimes necessary, but it's also really hard in terms of a learning structure. Like if I came on tonight and just started yelling about women's rights, like nobody likes that. And so that second or third exposure of talking about something or presenting it in a slightly different way, I think can be the place where kind of that real change or that real conversation can actually start to happen. Because at that point, they have a little bit of information and then they can kind of go on. Knowing what's happening in the legislature is very important too. Yes, if certain bills are in front of the legislature that you don't agree with, let your voice be heard in the most efficient way possible. Absolutely. I think, Betsy, that's a great point to make. And I think what's also very important is talk to your city, your county, and your state legislatures. We often focus so much at the federal level. Like in Sedgwick County, we have an issue in which there are judges upon judges who have no opposing person because the Democrats don't run against them. So it's the same voices. There's a lot of different ways in which you can make your voice heard. You can, voting for county commissioners, voting for city councilors, voting for people in all different levels of government, but also, as Betsy points out, letting them know about how you feel about certain bills. A lot of people now who serve in public office have Facebook pages, they have Twitter, but they also have official ways of communication. And some of them are actually required to respond to you. So making a point, I have every morning since, oddly enough, November 2016, I have gotten up and I have contacted members of my representative and the senators from Kansas. And then if there's stuff going on in Kansas during the state legislative session, which there often are, I add them to the list. And for about 20 minutes in the morning, I communicate with them. And every once in a while, I get to say something complimentary. But a lot of times it's a push. And, I think depending on where you are on the political spectrum, that always changes. But being in contact with people can be a really great way of making sure that your voice is heard. Very few people do this, so you might actually be the person who changes somebody's mind or gets them to affirm, like, yeah, my position on this, where I want to support this bill, I'm right, because I got 5 people who responded, who wrote in or called in, and that kind of lets them know. 5 people doesn't sound like a lot, but I'm not kidding. There's not a lot of participation sometimes. Like, people deluge kind of the famous person of the moment inboxes, but we live in Kansas. Very few of our representatives or senators are the famous person of the moment. And so having that constant conversation with them can be important. And, it's what you get when you're a voter, is you get this representation. And so now, your voice doesn't have to wait for 4 years or 6 years or 2 years. It can be pretty consistent.
That is such an excellent point.
Dr. Henry, can I say something really quickly?
Absolutely.
So I was on Roland Park City Council, and chickens was the big topic of the day, whether or not we were going to have chickens. And I did my research, and I listened to people, and I listened to the majority, what the majority wanted, and we got chickens. And it turned out to be quite popular. And now some more Johnson County cities are getting chickens. So you can be heard local level, and then move it as far up the chain as you can.
Yeah. And I think it is really important to focus on local levels, because that's really where a lot of your day-to-day life is controlled by. If you have something that you don't like about your city, the federal government is not the entity that you need to complain to or talk with. But the chicken example is perfect because, that's something that a subsection of people are really knowledgeable about. And then a lot of everyone else is like, well, but this is an urban area. it's not a farm. And that misunderstanding about what it is, and yet it has become very popular, even more so during the pandemic, that people have fresh eggs. They don't have to go to the store, or, you know, they don't have to go to the farmer's market. But yeah, I think those are great conversations. And it doesn't have to be like a lightning rod thing either. I mean, we got a traffic light at I live on the quiet end of a busy street that tees into a busy street. And so a left turn prior to getting that stoplight was nearly impossible. And so, you know, it was something that we talked about, and there were kind of questionnaires, and everything kind of came to pass. And it was a couple of years, but it happened, and that was nice. We've had conversations about what to do with all those city pools, you know, how to transform them and still save money. So there's just ways that you can affect your community. And I don't know about the rest of you, but it just always makes me feel really good and connected. I moved around a lot. Wichita is the longest place I've ever lived in my life. And it was nice to feel connected and part of a community, and to have a say in what's going on.
I was just going to add that I think the most important thing about this is making sure that we're not afraid to use our voice, that we have our voice, we have our vote. It's important, and we should be using it. It's going to look different for each and every one of us in concern of how we're going to use it, but to use it to push for good, push things forward, and get chickens in our local neighborhoods.
I mean, not to be too dramatic, but people died for this. So, you know, it's not something that is just kind of is there. It's something that people fought long and hard for. They died, they suffered, and they didn't get to vote. And so you hold the key not only to your immediate circumstances, but are standing on the shoulders of people that wanted you to be able to do this, who thought that you, because you're a woman, because you qualify in all the different other ways of being a voter, should vote. And so the most popular vote actually is the non-voter right now. So statistically, the non-voter won the 2016 election.
Well, yeah, we knew that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so like that actually is a pretty common refrain within local politics too. I mean,
that's absolutely.
Vote in the primaries. Y'all
Yes.
vote in the primary. I mean, I'm kind of a nerd for voting. Okay. We need this conversation every month, not just March. Absolutely. Women continue to make history every day. Great job. Yes. Thank you very much, Mark. I'm a big fan too.
You have a fan.
But I think he brings up a really good point, is that, you know, we're all of a sudden like super engaged with Black History Month for February, and then we go immediately into Women's History Month, and then like the switch turns off for a while, and then we come back around to it. And these are groups of people that need to be highlighted, and the issues that are brought up every February and March need to be talked about all the time, to where it is a common conversation. It's not just, oh my God, it's March. And, you know, women's historians, and I know my friends who are African-American historians, we always kind of have this joke of like, your calendar just fills up just a little bit more during these months. And it's all, I mean, I generally have a policy of how many things I say yes to, except for March. Like I'll say yes to pretty much everything during March, because this is the most obvious point of contact. So if y'all asked me in like June, I would have been like, oh, hell no. I'm just kidding. This is fun. But that idea of being like overcommitted is something I think that a lot of women experience. And so I'm trying to like balance that out as best I can. I'll let you know when I get there. But that constant conversation, I think, needs to be something that is continued, and it's just not like put away for a full calendar year, because who knows what March is going to look like next year. Hopefully more people-y.
More connection, more in-person connection.
In person,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, it is almost 8 o'clock and we don't want to take up any more of your time. This was wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Henry. Woohoo.
You're very welcome. Thank you all for having me. And thank you all for such great conversation and questions. You all did such a great job listening, but bringing your own experiences to it. And this was really fun. I would definitely say yes in June. So
yes. All right. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Everyone on live, everyone who is watching the recording, thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you were able to grab different nuggets. There was so much information that was put forth. It was we're getting lots of applauses in the chat. So I'm just going to put a couple of them. Lots of applauses, lots of great jobs. So good stuff. This will be recorded, and I'll make sure that I post it. Feel free to share it. This is an important conversation, and it's not over, right? There's still things that are happening today that just 2 or 3 people can come together and decide that they're going to affect change. So have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thanks. You too. Bye, everybody.
Bye.